There was this one guy that I was talking to. He was a half Jew, but he had hidden papers, and he was married to a Jewish woman. He was in the German military. He gets this notice in 1943, I believe, that his wife and his baby boy are deported to Auschwitz. He just thinks it's a work camp, and he realizes his wife was sent to Auschwitz, and he's really emotional. And so I turn off the camera. I go up and give him a hug. But as I walked back, I looked over at his wife, and she's fuming. But as I sat down, I quickly found out that she wasn't ticked off at me. She was infuriated with her husband because this was the first time in 50 years of marriage that she found out she was the second wife.
Wow.
She had never heard this story. And even crazier is that his little boy that was killed in Auschwitz, he used the same name to name their first son.
If you're tired of arguing with strangers on the internet, try talking with one of them in real life.
Welcome to Back in America, the podcast.
Bryan Mark Rigg, you're a PhD historian. You are a military historian. You are a writer, an author. You are a former USMC officer, even a wealth manager. And we are going to cover a lot of that. But for this first question, I really would like you to close your eyes and to take me back to Leipzig, 1992. You are 21. You are looking at your great-great-grandparents' birth certificate, and the word mosaic is staring back at you. How does that make you feel?
I was finally able, with the Iron Curtain coming down in 1989, to go back to these areas in true freedom. Some Westerners were able to go to the DDR, but not often. Now it's wide open. All my ancestors from the German part of Germany that was communist. And so I'm in these little towns around Leipzig and Dessau. And as I'm finding out about my great-great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents and seeing the Mosaic classification next to the religion, Jewish, it was just shocking to me because I was always brought up as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, very Gentile, if you will. And during this process, when you asked me how I felt, I just started thinking to myself, why did my family hide this when they came to America? They were obviously scared of something. And of course, the obvious answer to that is they were trying to escape anti-Semitism, which was very prevalent in the churches and society of Germany and Austria of that time. When they
They moved in 1864.
1864, yeah, you've done your homework. So they came over in 1864. And then I also was thinking, hey, had they remained there, this branch of my family most likely would have been slaughtered in the Holocaust. So it got me thinking, okay, why is there anti-Semitism? Why were they ashamed of this? What does it mean to be Jewish? And why the heck did Hitler slaughter 6 million of them during World War II? So the knowledge of that started making me ask a lot of questions about history and society and my family that I would have never otherwise been asking.
Take us back to where you were. What was the room like? What were the people around you? Was it an archive room? What was it like?
The one town, there were several towns where my family came from: Jesnitz, Dubin, and Barbie on the Elbe, Barbie on the River Elbe. And so in this initial stage of finding out this information, I was in this town called Barbie on Elbe. And when I went there, the people in the courthouse were very nice to me. And in my broken German and their broken English, because they grew up under Russian oppression, not many people spoke English. They put me in touch with the town scholar, and he knew English pretty well. And he was a German Panzer veteran, really nice man, talked about World War II with me an awful lot. I didn't know about my Jewish background at this time. I just told him my family had come from this region and some of them had lived in this town. And would he help me look into the archive? So he took me to a wing of the courthouse that was a very dusty, looked like something out of Harry Potter, very kind of dark, dusty, with all these big leather bound books going back to the 1600s that were all the death certificates, marriage certificates, and birth certificates of that region. And as we started spiderwebbing through my family, he got shocked and he was saying about the religion. And instead of saying Katholisch or Lutherisch, Lutheran or Catholic, which I was expecting to hear Lutheran, he was saying Mosaic or Mosaic. And that means Hebrew or Jewish. And I was like, no, are you sure you got the right guy? This is not my grandfather. This is not the grandmother that I remember being told about. And he's, no, that's actually correct. And he was a little kind of nervous because he had just told me about his time in Russia as a German soldier. But he was still very professional and was writing up the certificates for me and very nice. And that was the kind of setting. It was like a place that not too many people went to. Many of these books probably hadn't been opened in decades. I would even say when we got back to the 1700s, I wouldn't even be surprised if some of these books had been open in 60, 70, maybe 100 years. He's blowing off dust, spider webs, and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that
All
was
right.
the setting of my research.
Wow. So you discover that you've got this heritage and you grew up in the Bible Belt.
That underline that multiple times. I grew up in Arlington, Texas. My family were members of a very evangelical, very conservative church called Pantico Bible Church. So I was brought up any kind of knowledge about the Jews. On one side, there was this praising of the Jews and praising of Jesus as a king of the Jews. And then out of the same breath, they would ridicule the Jews for killing God, killing Christ, being rebellious. So this was the kind of environment that I grew up in, which had really no connection to Judaism at all.
Now I'm taking you to Berlin. You are going to the theater to watch a movie called Europa, Europa, I read it.
Yep, that's right.
And an old man, Millis, approach you and he says, that's also my history.
Yeah.
Right? His brother was decapitated in 1943. At the end of your conversation, he started to cry. 1-year-old.
Yep.
So how did that moment really impacted the rest of everything you've been doing?
So for those who are listening who haven't heard about Europa, Europa, in German it's called Ich war Hitlerjungen Solomon. I was the Hitler youth called Solomon. It's on Netflix. It's a very good film. It's about a Jew, Shlomo Perel, who served in the Nazi military and about his survival. And so before this film began, I had helped this elderly gentleman, Peter Milius, who you may find a seat. We talked during the film. After the film, I asked him, what did you think? And he said, it's very close to my own history. Would you like to go talk? And I said, sure. So we went to a local bar and we talked for the whole night. And this is the first time that Peter had really told me about a lot of the things that had happened to him. You mentioned about his brother that was in a neighboring unit outside of Leningrad. And he was actually, he identified his brother who had been blown up with a whole bunch of other guys in a bunker by an artillery round. And his brother had been decapitated. Very traumatic. He was in a lot of tears. His children later told me this story he had never told them. So this is the first time it really came up and he was telling a total stranger. It turned out that Peter was of Jewish descent himself and had been serving in the military. So at this stage of the game, I was thinking after this experience, Stan, I was thinking, what are the coincidences that this kid from Texas goes to Germany, finds out about his own Jewish background during this course of study, then goes to a movie about a Jew who served in the military, only to sit next to another gentleman of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military. And another story that you may not know in the literature that you've looked up on me is that when I was growing up, I was told a story by one of my uncles, Uncle John Little, that I had a great uncle who served in the American Army during World War I. And in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he, like many other American guys, would take stuff off dead Germans, medals and whatnot. And one guy he took the stuff off of, he took a diary off of, and the guy had the same last name as him, Barbie, with a Y. We brought back the diary to my great-grandfather and some other relatives, and they read it, and they found out that this was a cousin of his. This was a relative. And so in my mind, when I found out about my Jewish background and I knew this story about my family, I was thinking, that's strange. This guy could serve, he supposedly had Jewish background, just like I'm finding out all about my German Jewish background, my family. So he served in German military in World War I as a person of Jewish descent, had no problem. But had he survived the war, 20 years later, he had been thrown in the ovens. So this also got me thinking, about this strange story on my own family's background, what it means to serve nations, and how this country just switched all of a sudden. How could this cousin that served died for his country, and this strange reunion that my uncle had with him, how could that all transpire? And then in light of the Holocaust. So a lot of these events really came through, or these stories came in my head during this time with Peter Milius after the movie, and really got me asking, okay, let's look into assimilation. How many of these people were served? What happened to all those World War One veterans? There was over 100,000 of them that served in the German military during World War One. What happened to them during World War II? And so was
Yeah.
the genesis of that journey.
And yet you come back to Yale, speak to your professor, Harry Turner's,
Yeah.
and your professor says focus on serious German history instead of chasing after curious anomalies.
Yep. Who will not add anything to our understanding of German history. Study some
All right.
serious German history. It's interesting. Henry Ashby Turner is a legend in the German historian circles. No doubt about it. His book on German big business and the Nazis is a classic work. The 30 Days to Power that he studied about how Hitler got power is a classic work. But he was for lack of a better term, he was a south end of a northbound mule. He was a very nasty human being, was not a really good leader of students. So you're right. When he first was confronted with this information, he was very negative. Turner didn't think I could do it. He also didn't think there was anything there and was extremely negative. And he was encouraging me for many years not to pursue this. Fast forward to 2002, when my book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, came out, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but when the book came out, he came to the celebration that Yale University threw for me. And he got up and held my book up. And you could see that he had read it. He had dog-eared a lot of pages and so on. And he says, I have a confession to make. And I did not know what he was going to say. But he said, I want to say, I'm glad Bryan did not listen to me, because had he listened to me, this first rate of German history would have never been written. And sat down. And many people later on told me, who had known him for decades, they said, that's the only time I've ever seen Henry Turner praise a student in public.
Wow.
And we did come around, but at first, you're right, Stan. He was very negative. Nobody thought I was going to find anything with this, and nobody had looked into it about Jews and men of Jewish descent who had served in the Nazi military.
And what gave you the strength and the confidence to carry on?
Peter's good friend, who I got in touch with soon thereafter, Niels Stromer, he knew about the story of Helmut Schmidt, the former chancellor of Germany, who I became friendly with later on, who was of Jewish descent and served in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force in World War II. And so as I started digging into this, Stan, and three names became 6 names, 6 names became 20 names, 20 names became 30. As I started looking into this more and more, I was like, there's a lot of guys out there. Nobody's really looked into this. When Henry Turner and other professors, because he wasn't alone, told me that I wasn't going to find anything in this, Hitler killed all people of Jewish descent, I would ask them, has anybody, to your knowledge, looked into this, or have you looked into it? In assimilation, and how many people were the quote unquote, what the Nazis called half Jews and quarter Jews? Because Peter was a quarter Jew in the Nazi military, according to Nazi parlance. And all of them came back and said, we don't know anybody that's looked into it, and we haven't either. So I was like, then how can you say I'm not going to find anything?
So what you did find is that 150,000 men of Jewish descent served in the Nazi army.
Yeah.
And that number is either not known of anyone, or people don't really want to know about it. What do you think it is?
At first, when people initially hear about my research before they read the book, and they're in Jewish communities, sometimes they come to the conclusion that what I'm writing about is that a whole bunch of yeshiva students are manning the ovens at Auschwitz. These are traitors. How could they do all this and so on? And that couldn't be any further away of the truth. On the other side, people hear about this and they're like, Hitler killed everybody of Jewish descent. You're not going to find anything. Nothing is black and white in any history that you go into. And the one question that people weren't asking is that people who were not classified as Jews according to the Nazis, what happened to them who had Jewish background? So when you look into the racial laws, a Jew, according to the Nazis, was a person who practiced the Jewish religion or had more than three Jewish grandparents, three or more Jewish grandparents. So the Nuremberg laws, when it came out, it classified these whole new groups of half Jews, two Jewish grandparents, or quarter Jews, one Jewish grandparent. And when you look at assimilation in Germany and how prevalent it was for 200 years leading up to Hitler, there were more people of Jewish descent than there were Jews in Nazi Germany. And when you look at the military laws, it actually drafted these guys into the military. They had to serve. So when you look into this and you see how this history unravels, it makes sense when you start studying demography, when you start studying assimilation, the Nuremberg laws, then this history makes perfect sense. These guys were in the military. What were their experiences now? And then what were the numbers? And you bring out 150,000. I believe 60,000 were half Jews, 90,000 were quarter Jews. And then you could probably tag on another 10,000 there and say 160,000 of quote unquote full Jews who were in hiding in the military. Because I interviewed a lot of full Jews who were in hiding and they could not really be ascertained as a number. But the quarter Jews and half Jews were fairly easy to ascertain because you just had to look at the mathematics, mixed marriages, conversion rates, and assimilation. And once you look at that, then the 150,000 makes perfect sense. But you got to put it in context. There was almost 18 million men who went to the ranks of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen SS. So these 150,000 represent less than 1% of the manpower. But in light of the Holocaust, it's quite shocking that they were there. But when you look at the assimilation numbers, it makes perfect sense.
So several things here. I was very surprised, to say the least, to see that Hitler personally signed exemption paper declaring individual Jew to be Aryan.
Yep.
That was mind-blowing, and you're going to talk about that. The other one was that the Werner Goldberg photo that was used as Nazi propaganda captioned the ideal German soldier, and the guy was half Jew.
Yeah, so these two stories, the first story, when Henry Turner told me, hey, and I have actually the letter, he actually put this to words. He says, quit chasing after some curious anomalies who will not add anything to our understanding of of the Third Reich and study some serious German history. But what was interesting is that I wasn't only documenting the common man on the front lines, the Frontschwein, as they call it in German, the front pigs, or the grunts, as we would say in English. But I was finding that very high-ranking officers actually were of Jewish descent, were what the Nazis called Mischlinge, half Jews and quarter Jews. And many of them, if they did very well, they actually got Aryanized by Hitler and were allowed to remain in the service. And many of them made it all the way up to five-star generals. The Field Marshal Erhard Milch, second in command of the Luftwaffe, was a half Jew. And so Hitler's looking at thousands of these applications, sometimes for grunts, privates and corporals and sergeants, but then all the way up to fleet admirals and so on. He is the final authority genetically on this. So that was a fascinating thing about Hitler's obsession with race and his belief that only he could determine with his signature who was going to be an Aryan and who was going to be a Jew. And in his warped view of science, he felt that a lot of these guys, if they were blonde and blue-eyed and strong and brave in combat in World War I and World War II, that their Aryan, quote-unquote, blood dominated them, had suppressed the Jewish blood. And that was his rationale for doing thousands of exemptions during the Third Reich and allowing these guys to serve at some of the highest levels of government. In fact, one guy, Helmut Wilberg, a three-star general, he developed the operational concept that we today call Blitzkrieg, the Bewegungskrieg, war movement. Fascinating characters, and Henry Turner was blown away by that as well. So now getting to Werner Goldberg. Werner Goldberg was in the German military. He was one of those guys with the phenotypical traits of the snow white blonde hair. He had wolf blue, sky blue eyes. They were penetrating. He was 80 and I saw him. They just haunted you. A wonderful man, very kind, served in the Berlin Senate later on, did an awful lot for Christian and Jewish healing and together work. But when he was in the military, he was in a unit outside of Berlin, and there were several battalions stationed around Berlin. And Goebbels through his propaganda ministry, wrote a lot of the unit commanders and said, hey, give me your most Aryan looking soldier. We want to do some propaganda around him. And several dozens of men were promoted as the typical Aryan soldier. And Werner Goldberg won the competition. And for about a year, his photo was paraded around all these propaganda magazines and literature and so on as the typical Aryan soldier until they found out his father was Jewish. And this is just an example of many of how the Nazi racial laws didn't meet up with reality and just how bogus they were.
It's
But that was a
yeah,
little funny story, and he's obviously on the front cover of my book.
but that to me is a metaphor of the absurdity of those racial laws.
Yeah, they're totally bankrupt and not related to reality at all.
God. So you interviewed 430 of those veterans face to face. Tell me, when they are telling you their story, you're looking into their eyes, as you just said. What does it feel like? What do you see on their face?
It's interesting. A lot of my preconceived notions when I went into this got totally changed when interviewing them. Many of them I thought would be very shy about talking about their experiences in war and what they saw, but many of them, a lot of times, it was the first time they were ever asked, and they wanted to get a lot off their chest. And then what I found with human psychology, that quite often when a person is interviewed the first time about his experience, quite often he answers with the truth because he hasn't gotten feedback or he hasn't double gone over and double questioned, if you will, what he has said to somebody. And they felt like they were between Scylla and this, between a rock and a hard place, because nobody really understood that. They go to the Jewish community, and the Jewish community a lot of times, oh, you served in the Nazi military? You're a traitor. They're in the German community and they're like, oh man, you're a victim. You lost all these relatives. So you must really feel bad about everything. And so they didn't know exactly where they fit. And many of them were very strong German patriots. So when I talked to them and I was getting their energy, first of all, I became with many of them very close. Several of them called me their American grandson, Robert and Margaret Brown in Vienna, Barbara Jacobi in Munich. I can mention a lot of these different names, and they would take me in, put me up, talk to me many times about their experiences, cry quite often. And when I went to them, it was freeing for them to talk about it. It was very enlightening for me. They were very enthusiastic to try to help me understand these two worlds they lived in. They were in the military, yet they lost family in Auschwitz. They felt persecuted, yet they were very German. And after the war, they did an awful lot to build back up Germany and get it back to where it should have been, and the Germany that they had initially fallen in love with. It was a very interesting schizophrenic situation that they kept bouncing back and forth from, but very enlightening from human psychology. And then once again, it helped you answer my main question is, who could know about the Holocaust? Did everybody know about the Holocaust? Absolutely not. And how limited information they had with what they were given at that time period, and then how they were just trying to survive with this new reality that the Third Reich threw on them.
You published the book, all those stories come out, and the reception is not all positive, right? Some critics said that your title is misleading. I'm sure a lot of people must have been pretty disturbed by those stories. Tell me, what happened?
Yeah, by and large, the people that matter, I would say, like Michael Barabau, former director of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., is a dear mentor of mine. He endorsed it enthusiastically. Paula Hyman, the former head of Judaic Studies at Yale University. I had Jonathan Steinberg at Cambridge University, incredible minds that endorse the work enthusiastically. What's interesting, those people who dispute the title, I take issue with that in my book. I trump their criticism because these people were, by Jewish law, the vast majority of the half-Jews were considered Jews by halakha. But then people would ask him, what about his research? What about Bryan? Cambridge University gave him a PhD on this. Henry Turner at Yale thinks it's a great research. Nobody to this day has poked any holes in the research, has shown any evidence to counter any of my claims. If any, there was probably much more than 160,000 people who served who were Jews or people of Jewish descent. And there was many more exemptions. And all my conclusions are pretty sound historically about what this tells us about the Third Reich. It feels a huge chapter of Third Reich research that had never been done before about looking at this population of assimilated half Jews and quarter Jews in the German population and what happened to them.
So you seem to like stories which are disturbing or unusual, and that brought you to doing massive years of research on the Medal of Honor stories of Woody Williams. So Woody Williams is the hero of Iwo Jima.
Yeah, Iwo Jima.
And what you learn, the more you research, the more you realize that his account, the official account of this battle, relied heavily on his own early recollection.
Yes.
And you to that earlier on. So, yeah, tell us more.
So in 2015, with the 70th commemoration of the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is like Mecca for Marines, it's one of the biggest battles. It's that famous flag raising
planting,
when you see it's the Mount Suribachi. And I was able to go there with my then 12-year-old son to walk the battlefield and be with a lot of Marine Corps veterans. And I was not thinking about being a historian or documenting any history. I just wanted to go experience this, be with fellow Marines, and show my son that freedom is not free. And the cost of preserving this democracy sometimes comes at a high cost of losing a lot of people in battle. So we go to Iwo Jima, and before we went, we saw a History Channel documentary on Iwo Jima. And a Medal of Honor recipient, the highest medal you can get in America for valor, was on the TV show, Woody Williams. And I thought it was very interesting to hear him talk and so on. And when we get to the conference and get to this travel group that we were going to be with to go all throughout the Pacific, Guam and Iwo Jima, Woody was on the trip. I see him walking down a hallway. I'm like, Woody? He's like, yeah, that's my name. He was 90, he was 92 at the time. And so when we were walking around the Battle of Guam and walking around Iwo Jima, I spent a lot of time with Woody talking to him. My son was there. Just to put this in context, about 70,000 men fought on Iwo Jima, rotating on and off of it. And you had 27 Medal of Honor recipients from that battle out of the 70,000 people. So I thought it was remarkable in 2015 that out of these 30, I was with one on the island walking around the battlefield with him. So after this week of being with Woody, I sat down with him. I said, Woody, you're a Marine. I'm a Marine. I'm a Yale Cambridge-trained historian. I'm trained on World War II. Even though I focused an awful lot on Nazi Germany, I know an awful lot about the Pacific War. I now know nobody's ever written up your biography. Nobody's ever written a biography of an enlisted Marine from World War II. Let's work together and get this together. And he was at first very enthusiastic. But as I dove into his history more and more, I realized there was a lot of problems with his story and that he had made up a lot of stuff along the way about his life on so many levels. How many children his mother had lost in childbirth or soon after they were born. How many people he had killed in combat. Just things left and right that he was just making up all the time, which it just didn't sound right to me. And as I got into the record more and more, I found out that he was the only Medal of Honor recipient of the 27 that got the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima, that Admiral Nimitz, the head of the Navy of the Pacific, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Vandergrift, and then the head of the Fleet Marine Force, all the divisions of the Marines, General Geiger, did not sign off on the medal because the evidence wasn't there. There was something wrong with it. And our U.S. President, POTUS, has the ability to pull the process away from the military. Most often he does not, but President Truman did this in this case, pulled it away from the military, fast-tracked it, and got the medal to Woody because he wanted to have a live Medal of Honor recipients to give medals to in the Rose Garden after the war was over in October of 1945. He didn't want to have whiny, crying mothers and widows. He wanted real warriors. And Woody was one guy that was in this no man's land of not being decided on because the evidence wasn't there. So as I dove into it more, I found out, basically, to make the long story short, Woody was an uneducated high school dropout kid from West Virginia. He gets drafted and he goes into the Marine Corps. He has a Napoleon complex because he's very short and he's been picked on an awful lot. He comes from West Virginia. He's just a good old Southern country boy. And he survives Iwo Jima. He did some heroic acts on it, and he comes back, and he's now in a role of authority as a corporal, and he's teaching guys how to handle the flamethrower, the portable flamethrower. That was his weapon that he used on the day that he did his deeds for his Medal of Honor. And what he probably did is took out maybe 2 pillboxes, maybe 3, maybe killed around 8 Japanese. A really good day on Iwo Jima, but there was like 5,000 pillboxes, reinforced cave entrances, and bunkers on Iwo Jima. Taking out 2 or 3 of these on any given day was just a common thing for a lot of guys, and I document that thoroughly in my book. When Woody gets back to Guam to train for the invasion of Japan,
Sorry, pillboxes?
pillboxes. So pillboxes are bunkers, but they look like a pill, and they're circular concrete defensive positions. And that's
Okay.
pillboxes.
Okay.
Bunkers are kind of like rectangles.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
have slits too.
Okay.
And then Iwo Jima was full of all these caves. And what they would do is they would build out the entrances with fortifications.
Okay.
and
Sorry
so-
for interrupting. Yeah.
No problem. A lot of times, the only way to kill the guys was to burn them out. In fact, some sources have that out of the 20,000 Japanese that garrisoned that island, half of them were burned alive because that's the only way you could get to them because they weren't on the island. They were in the island. And that's how you killed them with our Satan tanks that were flamethrower tanks and then our portable flamethrower that guys carried on their backs. And they would go up to these pillboxes and bunkers and flame them out. So Woody comes back and everybody's now training with the flamethrower for the invasion of Japan because they're finding this is one of the most effective weapons against the Japanese and how they fight. In Okinawa, they're all in caves. And as Woody is talking to all the guys that he's training, he's one of the few survivors of his unit from Iwo Jima, and they start asking him what he did and whatnot. And he just has any typical 20-year-old man who's gone through a lot of hell and is proud of it. He starts telling what we can say in the Marine Corps sea tales. He starts embellishing. His 4-pound fish becomes 20 pounds. And he's making stuff up left and right. Now, he wasn't doing this to get the Medal of Honor. But the unintended consequence of this was that this story got into the official record at his company level duty hut. And then it got moved on to the battalion level duty hut. And all of a sudden they look at it and they think this is Medal of Honor worthy. And they got the scientific process backwards. Instead of going and finding witnesses to support what Woody supposedly did, they're hearing through the telephone scenario where one person tells a story, another person tells it, another person tells it. And before you know it, it gets to the commander and he writes it up thinking it's Medal of Honor worthy. Then they go try to find the evidence and they couldn't find it. That's why Admiral Nimitz and General Vandergrift rejected it because the affidavits didn't support what he was saying. So obviously when I confront Woody 70 years later with his lies, he had believed so much into his greatness. He was going around on Air Force One with President Trump. There are schools named after him. There are major ships, twice the size of the Titanic, named after him. Expeditionary Sea Base Ship number 4 is the USS Woody Williams. You have military bases. There's a God complex a lot with these guys that have Medal of Honor recipients, Medal of Honor awards, because they are treated with incredible reverence. If you walk into a room in America, you're a Medal of Honor recipient, generals are supposed to stand up and salute you. They're saluting the medal, but nonetheless, they're saluting the person who's carrying it, obviously, too. And so Woody has never had anybody question him. Nobody has ever looked into his military file. Another thing that he was lying about, he's talking about his beautiful fiance and wife and how she's the glory of his time. And I find out he's 2-timing her during the war. Everything just falls apart about his history that he promotes versus what really happened. And when I confronted him, instead of him working with me about how this story got out of hand, why he lied, and being honest, which is how we're trained as Marines, He slapped a federal lawsuit against me and tried to prevent the book from coming out. And I had to go defend myself, and I won
Mm-mm.
in a Supreme Court of West Virginia. So
What does it tell you about the making of heroes in America? In America, you love the good old story of the underdog. You love to have heroes. As you said, that guy's name is all over the place. What does it tell you about the construction of memory, the construction of hero, and the need we have as a society for heroes?
humans like to be inspired. And America, because of our origins, and thank you, French, again, for helping us during the Revolutionary War. We couldn't have done it without you. We always love the story of the underdog. It is something that's just part of our mindset. It's how we started out. Taking on the British Empire at the beginning was no small feat, and we won. So we like that type of story. It's part of our society and public consciousness. Now, how a hero is made, if people are truly honest, we should love our heroes not because they're perfect, but because of what they do despite their imperfections. I think there's something also along the lines of the people that we put out there as heroes, that if you really start looking at them, you can get very disappointed very quickly. So a lot of times we don't want to see those people with imperfections because they inspire us. If we knew all about their imperfections, we wouldn't be inspired. And people want hope. They want to think the best of a lot of other people quite often. And that's something that's very interesting with this tradition of making heroes with the Medal of Honor. What happens to those guys? The pressure that they incur themselves. Many of them can't handle the pressure themselves. A few of the Medal of Honor recipients that I talked to said it was a burden they wouldn't want to wish on anybody. It's kind of some people who talk about fame.
Do you think it was important for you to tell the story behind Woody William, or would have everybody been better off not knowing that?
It's interesting. I even had a Marine Corps general tell me, don't publish the truth, publish the myth. I was like, that's not how we were trained in the Marine Corps. Honor, courage, and commitment is to be honest and straightforward. And I must say, Commandant Charles Krulak, Commandant Al Gray, both read my book and they supported it, wrote forwards and said, tell the truth. Nietzsche said it, and I think Plato said it in their different versions, but they said they rather have the ugly truth than beautiful lies because that's the only way we get better. When I first started this research, I had rose-colored glasses. I thought I was going to write the story that I heard Woody say. And I thought we would both be on stage as brother Marines, and I told his story and hoorah, rah. I documented his unit, praised the men that never came back, and this is our hero, and so on. And I still do that. I really go into his unit and put a name and a face with a lot of heroes that people would have otherwise ever heard about. But we need to be honest about our history because that's what keeps democracy true. Is the ability to uncover the truth, deal with the truth, and hopefully use it to better us, the next generation. And that's why, and I was trained that way at Cambridge. You have a working thesis of whatever work that you're doing, Hitler's Jewish soldiers, Japan's Holocaust, Woody Williams, and then you let the evidence lead you to either support that hypothesis that you start out with or to modify it. And if you're honest, you modify it. Trust me, it would have been in my best interest. I would have probably already had a movie deal. I would have sold hundreds of thousands of books, possibly, if I had Woody behind me. By him fighting me, a lot of people came out and attacked me for attacking an old man, a hero. He's done more for the Corps than you ever would. And I understand where they're coming from. But ultimately, we're taught not to lie, especially Marines. And this guy lied. Just that simple. What a lot of people don't realize is when somebody gets the Medal of Honor, they get tax-free, today's dollars, $5,000 to $6,000 a month. They get free travel everywhere. They're treated like gods everywhere they go. There's a lot of perks with this. So I'm sure Woody, when he realized that people were starting to figure out about him, these may go away. A lot of his comrades realized he was lying. And they got in touch with him. And one of them said, you ever speak this way again, I'll come and kill you. And Woody, after that, which is very interesting, shot his mouth off with perfect recollection from 45 to, I believe this article came out in Men's Magazine in 1966. After that article, he then has a different psychology. He says, people tell me this is what I did. They say that it was so traumatic, I can't remember very much, but people have told me, instead of him being direct.
Wow. All right. So you also mentioned that Japan killed 30 million people during World War II,
Yep. Japan slaughtered 30 million people from
which is more than Nazi Germany.
3 times more.
Wow. Why isn't that common knowledge?
I go into good questions, and I struggled with this a lot when I did this research on this. There's a few reasons for it. One is the reason why we know so much about Nazi Germany is that we had an intelligentsia around the world in Austria, New Zealand, England, America, and Canada that were Jewish. And they wanted to tell the truth. And they were academics and professors and whatnot. And they started exploring the documents, and the documents were open in Germany. Most of the people that Japan slaughtered were Chinese. And there was chaos in China after the war with Mao Tse-tung and Kai-shek fighting each other. Also, Japan, unlike Germany, had been disgraceful in admitting their crimes and opening up their archives and having memorials to their victims. In fact, there's not one museum or one memorial in the entire country of Japan to the victims of World War II. Whereas in Germany, you have multiple museums, you have thousands of memorials, you have dozens of research centers that focus on this, and they've been honest. Also, another horrifying fact is Germany killed 11.7 million people. They have paid 90 billion in reparations since 1945. Japan slaughters 30 million people, and they paid only 1 billion in reparations. So those are probably the 2 main reasons. One is the group of people you would rely on to tell the history, the Chinese, did a horrible job after the war because Mao was worse than Hirohito. And then the second reason is Japan has not supported or pushed to get this knowledge out there about how bad they were, and they haven't asked forgiveness for it, unlike Germany.
Don't you think there is also a third reason, which is that the US kept Hirohito in power and used that to fight the Cold War? So the US preferred to keep all that under wrap?
Yes and no. You are right. America should have hung Hirohito up on the gallows and let him dangle for a long time. Hirohito was horrific. He was every bit a Hitler. MacArthur made a Faustian trade-off to keep him in power, to control the Japanese, to use it as a bulwark against communism in China. But as far as like influencing the history, MacArthur could have forced Hirohito to open up the archives still. There's a few people, not at the same level, but Albert Speer got off the hook in the Nuremberg trials. Erhard Milch got off the hook. Rudolf Hess got off the hook. A lot of guys who should have been killed, Nazi Germany didn't. So just because Hirohito was involved and was just as guilty as Tojo and the others doesn't mean that by letting him live, you had to suppress the history and the events that happened, because the Nazi history still got out, even though those guys were wasting away in prison or got out after 10 or 15 years of serving. So I think MacArthur could have done a better job of forcing them to open up their archives and forcing them to come to terms. That is a mistake, MacArthur, of many mistakes that he made. But I don't think that is one of the main reasons why. Now, you are onto something, Stan. You got me thinking. Hirohito was not in power anymore after the war, but he was still revered as a god and as the emperor of Japan. And behind closed doors, he could have still told a lot of people, hey, we got to do everything we can to prevent this information from getting out. And many of them would have followed it. When I read Herbert Bick's book, the biography, the definitive biography of Hirohito, he didn't uncover that necessarily, that part of the chapter. Hirohito was scared he was going to be killed. And he knew how involved he was, and he probably wanted to protect his own person. But as far as protecting the Japanese history at large, I haven't seen any evidence to that effect, but it wouldn't surprise me. So yeah, you may be right partially with that theory.
So we said that Japan killed 30 million people during World War II, but tell me more, who did they kill? How did they have like in a concentration camp like the
Yeah.
German? Or?
Yeah. See, unlike the Germans, who actually were very Germanic, very systematic, had it outside their country, were able to do it with their whole scientific community and industry behind it, having these factories of death in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor. The Japanese did it the old-fashioned way. They would go in, they raped everything. That's the credit. This military was so undisciplined. It would rape everything and usually bayonet and cut people's heads off, blow their brains out, and so on. Germans used a small group to do most of the killing. They used the SS. German military was where the bulk of the men were serving, and most of them were not involved with the killing machinery. Every couple of months or whatnot, most of the military units were fighting Russia. Whereas Japan, the units were doing a lot of the fighting, but the units, everybody was the SS, if you will, in the Japanese military. And when they went into regions, they would just wholesale slaughter and genocide and rape. And it was like it was like the German military was all the SS, and they were just interchangeably doing all the crimes anywhere they went, depending on what new people they took over. And so Japan, like with the rape of Nanking, I put it at 300,000 people were slaughtered from when they started the campaign in September in Shanghai of 37, and then ended it after they took over Nanking in December of 37, but then continued to do death and destruction until March of 38. During that day, they took over a swath of land about the size of the state of Connecticut in America, and they slaughtered 300,000 people, and they probably raped 90,000 women. So to answer your question, how did the Japanese do it? They did it the old-fashioned way with bayonets, knives, bullets.
Is it a story which is not well known?
It's not well known. I asked my famous professor at Yale, James Crowley, and I told him then, I was like, man, nobody's ever talked about that. This is probably just one example of many of an overall mass murdering machine of Japan. Why hasn't that happened? And he told me Japan's been very dishonest. And he says a lot of the research is hard to find. And he says, most people who study World War II just want to focus on Europe. He says, Bryan, you should do this. And that I write this in Japan's Holocaust. That was the beginning of me thinking, okay, as I go to Cambridge, and as I continue to study about World War II, I'm going to start creating an index file of all the atrocities that Japan did and the problems.
So you say that little guy from Arlington, Texas, that guy failed first grade twice. You were diagnosed with ADHD, dyslexia, speech impediment.
Yep.
Yet you made it to Yale, the Marine Corps, Cambridge.
Yep.
So what part of your story do you think is America failing you or catching you up?
Is America failing me or catching me up? That's an interesting question. I will say this. I've written a book about this called Conquering Learning Disabilities, because a lot of my friends were joking as they learned more about my past when I was at Cambridge. And then later on, they're like, yeah, if we could all be learning disabled, that's what they called me, LD, learning disabled, ADHD, and dyslexic. Yeah, we could then go to Yale and Cambridge and so on. I got my file from the Child Study Center in Fort Worth to look at what they were thinking of me when I was a kid. I was actually, the initial diagnosis was MBD, minimal brain damage, and HLD, hyperkinesis learning disabled. And I was very delayed in my speech. I didn't start speaking until I was 3. And anybody who's a parent know that a kid starts talking around 1. Yes, was America helping me or hurting me early on? I went to some private schools that did not know how to handle me, especially after I failed first grade twice. Public schools back then in the 70s wouldn't know what to do with me. We now have a lot of resources in our schools for special ed, is what it's called. What really helped me was I had a mother that was not going to give up on her son, and she was going to find every resource she possibly could, Marily Rigg, that her son would not suffer like she did growing up, being called stupid and idiot. Because my mom has dyslexia, and I am convinced she has ADD. She hasn't been officially diagnosed, but I now know enough about it that it's genetic, and it came from both my mother and father. So my mom was hell-bent making sure I got all the resources. So she took me to Eastersill, speech therapy, Scottish child psychologist, et cetera, and got me to private schools, small classrooms, which really helped me. I had a wonderful teacher at a special school called Star Point at TCU, Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, that really helped me learn how to learn and read. My mom got me involved with a lot of sports, which is really critical for a lot of ADD and ADHD kids to have that outlet, to have physical aggression out in the world, soccer, football, baseball. I played them all. So what saved me? America, in many respects, allowed for all these different organizations to be out there that my mom could tap into. Had I been in Syria or Afghanistan or some rigid countries like Germany, they wouldn't have known what I had, because Germany, they peg you early on of 3 different high schools. I would have never been going to the gymnasium in Germany because they would have pegged me as being a mechanic or whatnot early on because I couldn't read, I couldn't write. So America allowed that flexibility of thought. And I think that's the American spirit, as far as flexibility and being different, thinking out of the box. That did help me. Absolutely. And my mom was an American through and through. She was the granddaughter of a famous pioneer who's in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. You figure it out, you work the problem. And that's very un-European. My wife is Swedish. I've lived in Germany. And so that American mindset, Tocqueville, your cousin, wrote about American democracy. He talks about this, and that was part of my family. So I would say that America really helped me in having resources to deal with my LD. And we are probably one of the leaders in the world of focusing on this and finding ways of helping kids learn how to learn. Because now in the public schools, you have those resources. But what I had was getting to a private school with small classrooms. And that's the key, I think, for a lot of these kids, is having small classrooms.
So tell more about that, because this is fascinating for me. What you said about those values that are American, your ancestor. So what is it really that you think is different from a European point of view?
So I think that's one thing that's really different. Tocqueville writes about this. I love Tocqueville, by the way.
So what does he say, Tocqueville?
Talk about the American can-do mentality, that when people get here, whether they are French, Irish, or whatnot, there is a special smell in the air that allows you to look around and say, I can be that. I can do that. I can be a landowner. I don't have to be a Harcourt. I don't have to be a von Wittenberg and so on. So I think that's the difference a lot with the American attitude. And I also like the aspect of what Winston Churchill said about us. He says, American democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And that Americans, after exhausting all other options, eventually do the right thing. That we have this kind of shoot from the hip mentality. And that's what my wife says the same thing. She came over at 19 from Sweden because she didn't have the opportunities in Sweden that America afforded her. And now she's a veterinarian and she's running her own shop.
Wow. Bryan Mark Rigg, thank you so much. Last question. What is America to you?
I have a grandfather that was on the Mayflower. The founding father of Springfield, Samuel Chapin, is one of my ancestors. I'm related through my family trees to T.S. Eliot, J.P. Morgan, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the fighter against slavery, John Brown, person who probably started the Civil War. I have 3 great-great-grandfathers that fought for the Union and defeated the Confederacy. I had an uncle that fought the Japanese in World War II. I had a cousin that fought in Vietnam for two stints. My brother fought against Saddam in the first Gulf War. America is really entrenched in my history. I have 18 relatives that fought in the Revolutionary War, shoulder to shoulder with some of your grandfathers fighting for the independence of America. America to me is, we have a lot of problems, but through democracy, through trial and error, hopefully we're making it better. We don't have a civil war going on right now. That means America's a lot better than it was at that time, obviously. We don't have a Great Depression. We know we can recover. So what does it mean to be American? It means, I guess, to me, that you embrace religious freedom of speech. When you see evil in the world, you are hell-bent on killing it. You got to be ruthless. There is no way of being friendly with dictators and fascists. So there's a lot of things that being American means to me. The ability to study what I want, to be in the profession that I want. I could never be a financial advisor after just being an academic historian for a few years in most countries because of the rigidity. America allows that flexibility like we've been talking about. Nobody's asked me that question, Stan. I'm being off the cuff answering, but I'm very proud to be American because of what it afforded my ancestors, the great life that I have, the freedoms and history that this country has created in the world. There's more to be proud of than be ashamed.
Thank you for your time.
Stan, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you for listening. If this episode was interesting to you, share it with a friend or a family member who might want to hear it too. And if you have a minute, please leave us a rating at rate.backinamericathepodcast.com. Ratings are how podcasts get discovered. They push the show higher in search results and recommendations, which bring in new listeners. It is the single most useful thing you can do to support Back in America.